All right, welcome everybody to the 2024 season of Garden Hour. My name is Amanda Bachmann. I'm the Pesticide Education and Urban Entomology Field Specialist for SDSU Extension, and I'm based in the Pierre Regional Center. And we have a small but mighty crew here tonight hosting and presenting. We have Robin Buterbaugh, who is our new SDSU Extension Horticulture Field Specialist based in Sioux Falls. Robin, what are you going to be talking about tonight?
Oh, well, tonight I'm going to be talking about square foot gardening, a kind of gardening method usually in raised beds.
Awesome. And I've heard that Robin's got quite a few slides for you guys, so make sure to take some notes. And if you have questions at any point during the presentation, feel free to put those into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen if you're on a desktop or a laptop. On mobile, you gotta, poke around a little bit to find those buttons, but feel free to ask questions about the presentation. Feel free to ask questions about your garden or anything that's happening now that you want to get answers about. You can also type into the chat and keep an eye on that because we will be throwing in links to some of the resources and events that we'll be talking about. And if you need help at any point, you can hit that raise hand button and one of us will send you a chat and see what we can do to help you. And I'm going to be going over just some, insect news from early May. So that's going to be at the end of this. And feel free to ask your insect questions as well in the chat. But with those introductions out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Robin.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. So I actually just spoke about this at the Ready, Set, Grow event that the Watertown Coteau Master Gardeners put on. So if you're on from that event, apologize that you'll be seeing this again, but it'll just be even another chance to kind of absorb all this information. So what I'm going to talk about today is a gardening method called square foot gardening. Maybe some of you have heard of it or even tried it. I actually have not tried it. So I did a lot of research preparing for this, and I actually am going to do a square foot garden this year. I have my little like 4x4 and 4x8 beds all mapped out on paper so far. I haven't actually really gotten it into the ground yet. But this square foot gardening was based on a book that Mel Bartholomew wrote. I'm not sure exactly when. It was probably back in like the 80s or 90s. And he was actually an engineer, and he was really specialized in efficiency, and he also liked to garden. So that's where he came up with this idea of square foot gardening. So just going to go through a few of the benefits, some of the basic how-tos for getting started, and then a couple of the pros and cons related to square foot gardening. So square foot gardening has a number of benefits. It's a really simple and productive system. It's very approachable because you're kind of like consolidating things down into bite-sized chunks. So therefore, it's really good for all experience levels, whether you're just a beginning gardener or whether you're a really experienced gardener and just want to try something different this year. It's also really good for all physical abilities. You can kind of modify these square foot gardens to be raised up and on a deck or on pavers, so they're really accessible. They're also good for any geographical location. Just because you're gardening in a raised bed, you don't have to worry so much about what kind of soil you have, and then your weather and your climate. You can kind of make some modifications in that as well, as far as, season extension, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. In square foot gardening, it's also been proposed that it has a lot fewer weeds, and that's because you're primarily using a soil mixture, and you also have really close plant spacing, so that helps with competing out the weeds. And then there's also no tilling or digging, and that's just because you're using a soil mix and you're putting it in a raised bed, and then you can just plant in that small area and like use a little hand trowel to replant, but you don't have to get in there and till the whole area or dig it up. The mix that you use is good at retaining water, and so it's said that you use less water. I guess that probably really depends on your climate and, whether you're getting any rain, what type of year it is as far as weather goes. Um, it's also said to be easier to manage and control pests just because you're also, you're just looking at it in a little chunk at a time, and there's different plants that are placed within that garden. So you can kind of just like look for pests in a more manageable way. And there's also Some different techniques you can use as far as like the plant companions that you have in that garden that can kind of help with some of that pest control as well. And I'll definitely talk a little bit more about that later. It's just a really efficient use of space, so you can grow more food in a very small area. You can potentially have a longer planting window. A raised bed soil usually warms up a little bit faster, and then there's also some season extension techniques that you can use. And especially for suburban areas or, depending on where you live, it looks really nice. It's very neat and tidy and contained. Um, so that is appealing as well. So just a few of the basics for square foot gardening. Three premises are that you want to make use of vertical space. You really want to recycle each square once it's harvested, so kind of doing some succession planting and then creating deliberate diversity. So really having a mixture of plants in there, and that really helps, with nutrients, with soil structure, and with bringing in pollinators and all of that. So the 10 different steps in kind of thinking about your square foot garden is determining the location and the layout in your yard, building your boxes, thinking about the aisles between the boxes, the soil mix, laying out the grid, and then some basic plant care, plant selection, planting, watering, and then harvesting your square foot garden. So the layout is encouraging people to think in squares and not rows. So this is a much more efficient use of space. Typically, rows are part of farming and commercial gardening because you need to get equipment through there. But in square foot gardening, this is an example from Cornell, and they actually calculated out the number of carrots you could get in a square foot versus a conventional 10-foot row with paths on both sides. And you can actually get a significantly larger amount of carrots. And that would be the same for any of the vegetables that you would want to plant. You're maximizing the amount of vegetables that you can get in a small space because you don't need to leave room for aisles because it's all in a raised bed. So as far as location, just like any typical garden, you're going to want it to be in a spot that's got a lot of good sun. It can be in your yard. You could even have square foot beds in a greenhouse. You could have them on a patio or on a deck. You do want to avoid low-lying areas where there might get water pooling. It's good if it's convenient or accessible. I mean, that's good for any garden. You want to be able to get out there and not let your tomatoes and all your plants languish if it's out of sight, out of mind. And as I mentioned, you really want it to be a reachable size. So usually not more than 4 feet across if you can get around all of the different sides so that you really only have a 2-foot reach. If it's next to a wall, then you definitely want to keep it to a 2 to 3 feet wide so that you can reach into the back without kind of trampling on the garden or having to lean over too far. So the layout for these gardens can be very simple. They can kind of be a little bit more complicated. The picture on the right just shows kind of like a typical container garden. It's just a square and it's one pot and it's got a plant in it and you can put them just about anywhere on a step or anything. Obviously, you can use a round planter too. It doesn't have to be square. The middle image there is just kind of a typical 4 by 4 square foot garden with a trellis on the back. So it's got 4 feet by 4 feet and it's divided into 1-foot grids. So you can get 16 different planting areas in that square foot garden. And the picture on the left shows some concrete blocks around the edges that you can plant some smaller plants in. And then you can actually have different levels for your square foot garden for plants that might require a little bit more depth for planting. So the boxes themselves really can be just like any other raised bed. You do want to have them pretty much in squares or rectangles just to make it easier for measuring and dividing out into that grid. The book recommends 6 inches and says that most plants can be grown in a 6-inch depth. However, I do know there's probably quite a few plants that would prefer to have deeper soil. So you can make deeper boxes, or you can even just put a smaller box on one of the grids if you'd like to do that. So the beds can be like a raised bed on the ground. It can be an elevated raised bed on, legs where it's up on your deck or something, so it's easier to reach. You don't have to be down on your knees bending over. It could even really be in the ground, but kind of the premise of the square foot gardening is it contains all of the soil mix and all of that. So you don't really see in-ground square foot gardens quite as often. The materials, again, can just be anything that you would use to make a raised bed. I mean, it could be recycled materials, salvaged, could be wood, brick, stone. You just don't want any chemical treated wood, obviously, because you don't want chemicals leaching into your vegetables. And I did find that these kind of square blocks are commercially available, and you can fit a 2x6 into those different notches in that picture on the very bottom, and you can stack those up to be 2 feet tall. So that's a really easy way for somebody like me who doesn't really have any building skills to be able to easily construct a square foot or whatever type of raised bed garden really easily. So when you're creating your boxes, you also want to add some sort of a weed barrier to the bottom, especially if you're just putting this directly onto grass. You can use cardboard instead. If you're in an area where you might have voles or some of those other types of pests, you can put some wire mesh on the bottom, but that's really just optional. And if you have deep beds, you could fill them with some additional materials like wood or mulch or straw, just so you're not having to use so much of the soil mix to fill up those beds. If you are using wood or wood mulch, you definitely want to make sure that it's old and has been cut for a while, because if it's a freshly cut tree, then that can tie up nitrogen in the soil. So you don't want that. You want it to be like decomposing wood. The aisles, typically you want them to be at least 3 feet apart. That just makes it easy for getting a wheelbarrow through or different equipment. For accessibility, it's important to have that amount of space for a wheelchair. But other than that, you can really have aisle materials out of just about anything, as long as it's sufficient for you to be able to get around. So whether it's grass, wood mulch, gravel or pea rock, dirt, or even up on pavers or on a deck. So the soil mix that the book recommends is called Mel's Mix, and that's just equal parts of peat moss or coconut coir, 1/3 or another part coarse vermiculite, and another part compost. And that is just a good ratio to be able to retain water and to allow drainage and to provide nutrients. And so when you're adding soil of any kind to a raised bed, you just want to calculate how much you need, because it does take a lot of soil. So for example, a 4x4 bed that is 6 inches deep will need 8 cubic feet of soil mix. So you do need to keep that in mind. And that's why you might want to use some of that additional fill material if you have deeper beds. So one component of that soil mix is the peat moss or the coconut coir. That's a natural material that adds organic matter. It retains water. There are some issues with peat moss and sustainability. There's a lot of the peat moss companies, especially the ones in Canada, who claim that the peat moss is regenerated at a rate faster than it is being used. But as you see in the picture, similar to forestry, a lot of those replanted areas don't have the same ecological value as what they originally had. So that's something to think about if you are looking at soil mixes that have peat moss. Coconut coir is a good alternative. Coarse vermiculite, as I mentioned, is good for retaining water, but keeping the soil loose. It's just mica rock that's ground up and heated, so it pops up like popcorn. You can see in that picture there that it just has kind of expanded and it's really light. And the difference between vermiculite and perlite is that vermiculite is better for retaining water, but the perlite is better for drainage. And then the other component of the soil mix is compost. So of course you can make your own compost, you can purchase compost. The book recommends you mix several types together just so you're getting adequate nutrients. And that can be worm castings, different types of well-aged manure, mushroom mulch. And then the other thing that the book recommends is adding more of that compost every time that you harvest something out of the square foot garden. Especially if you only have 6 inches of soil, you really need to make sure that you're replenishing the nutrients so that you can grow or continue to grow more vegetables. And then when making that soil mix, just You basically can just dump it all out on a tarp, the equal parts, and then mix it all together, break up any clumps. And then also when you're adding it to your raised bed, add a couple inches of that soil mix, wet it down, and then continue to add more. That just helps it rehydrate. Otherwise, sometimes with potting soil, they're very water phobic. So the water will just sit on top or soak through, but it won't actually get the mix wet. So that's just helpful for getting that water retention in there right away. The grid can be pretty basic. It could be string, it could be wood lath. I've heard in one of the square foot garden websites that I went to recommended like vertical blinds that they just stapled together. So it really can be anything that you have around that's convenient for you to use. And you just measure out 1 foot squares and put your grid on there. So the weeding is usually less just because the soil mixture doesn't have weed seeds. And the soil is very light and easy to weed if you do get some seeds that have blown in. Additionally, the close plant spacing prevents some of those weeds from growing. However, you can use different mulch like grass clippings or straw if you need to, especially as plants are just starting and they're smaller. Some of the basic care, nutrients, you want to keep adding compost, as I mentioned, to the squares before replanting. And you do want to monitor your plants, especially if they're heavy feeders for nitrogen, just to make sure that you're not seeing any nutrient deficiencies. Watering at the base of the plants as needed. Mulch would help with that, with retaining water. Watch for pest and disease problems. With raised beds and these square foot gardens, it is actually pretty easy to protect the plants with different row covers. And then that companion planting or planting aromatic herbs throughout helps deter some pests. And then you definitely don't want to walk on the garden because that causes compaction. And the whole goal is to have it be small enough so that you can reach to all of the different areas. So plant selection is important, especially if you just have a really small space. Definitely just grow the plants that you like. You don't need to waste some of that space that's at a premium growing some things that you don't like. It is fun to try new things though, so you can definitely experiment. And then when you're planting these gardens, you want to group the plants to maximize the cooperation and minimize competition. So what that means is plant plants that are kind of similar in size next to each other. If you have some large plants like a summer squash or a cabbage, and then you have some lettuce growing next to it, that might shade out the smaller plants. Same with the height. You want to plant the taller plants on the north side of the bed, if at all possible. Um, Square foot gardening is good for succession planting just because when one square is harvested, it's easy to plant something else there. You do have to plan ahead a little bit so that you know what's going to be getting picked, and then you have something there to replant. You could make the whole bed like a shorter season, like greens and spring vegetables, and then harvest all of that. Or you can intermingle things so that you're not having to replant the whole square foot garden at one time. It just depends on what you want to do. And then polyculture, which is mixing multiple crops in the same location. It might be heard of as intercropping or companion planting, is a good way to kind of reduce pests and to help the plants work together and provide some nutrients and increase the soil structure. It's good for pollination. This is an interesting book that I found that's actually talking about science-based companion planting strategies. I know a lot of our companion planting is kind of anecdotal, but this book was interesting because it actually has research studies that talk about all of the different proven benefits that certain plants have on each other. So for example, nitrogen, planting beans and potatoes together is good because the beans will help supply extra nitrogen to the potatoes. Same with lettuce and peas. And planting clover around your garden is also beneficial for adding nitrogen. Structure, plants that work together well are corn and beans for that aspect as well as for nitrogen, similar to the Three Sisters garden. And then some different examples. I'm not necessarily going to go through all of these, but there are different ways that plants can work together for pest management, either by using a trap crop, where one of the plants is more appealing to pests, so they will all go over to that one. If you're going to use a trap crop, you might want to plant that out of your square foot garden, so you're not attracting plant or pests to your garden area. Some disease management. Oats are supposedly good with potato scab. And then of course your dill or fennel is good for attracting beneficial insects that will feed on your aphids and things like that. And then, of course, adding pollinator plants, flowers, and different things that are going to attract pollinators are also very good as well to add into your square foot garden. You can use a seed template. They have some that are commercially available. Usually there's either 1, 4, 9, or 16 plants per square foot, depending on the spacing that's on the seed packet. Um, so here's a couple of examples of different vegetables and how many that you would plant in that square foot. So for extra large vegetables like cabbage or broccoli, they're gonna just have that one plant in that entire square foot. But for smaller vegetables that are planted 6 inches apart, you can get 4 in there. And then I would say, some of these examples show pumpkins or summer squash in a square foot garden. Honestly, I don't think that that would probably be the best use of space. I don't know about other people, but whenever I planted those, they pretty much take over the whole area. So you might as well plant those outside of your square foot garden. So watering is just typical as you would with any garden, but because that soil mix is good at retaining water, you don't need to water necessarily as much depending on the weather. They do recommend watering at the base of the plants and not just spraying over the top, especially because some of that close plant spacing and water could cause some disease issues. Um, so that's one thing to think about. Harvesting, you can harvest the plants in each square and then add the compost and then replant. You do still want to consider those rotations, like a root, fruit, leaf rotation to help cut down on pest or disease issues and for nutrient requirements. And potentially you can get up to 3 crops a year in every square foot if you do an early spring planting, a summer planting, and then even a fall planting. Although like a fall planting could include a cover crop as well. And then if you're not harvesting all the plants in a square, it's better to snip off the plants so you're not pulling up the roots just because that soil mixture is pretty loose. So another aspect of square foot gardening is vertical growing. So really maximizing the use of space. So here's just a couple examples of some of the different types of trellising that you can use. You can do homemade cattle panels. Really, the sky's the limit. It's up to your imagination. There's also different ways to extend the growing season. So you can add PVC and make little hoops, whether that's for plastic in the early season to kind of help act as a greenhouse, or even to prevent pests using netting or a different shade cloth in the summer. You can use hail cloth. You can even make a type of a cold frame in the picture on that bottom. It shows a cold frame that you could then take off once summer is there. Here's a couple examples of protection from pests using different cloth, or some more hardy pests would need some of the chicken wire. So if you've got rabbits or deer, you might want to go that route. And then a couple of the pros and cons. I talked about a couple of them, but some of the pros are it's easy to cover to keep out pests or hail or do season extension. It's really great for small spaces or places where aesthetics are important. Good for areas with poor soil, good for all gardener abilities. Can be simple. You only have to think about one square at a time, but if you want to be really complicated about it and plan for all of the different squares and all the succession planting, you can make it as challenging as you want. Fewer seeds if you're planting in a square. Then they recommend just putting seeds in each of those like locations, whether 9, 16, or 4. So potentially using fewer seeds, less maintenance and water just because of that close plant spacing, and then just being able to maximize the food grown in a small space. But some of the cons are that not all vegetables work well. As I mentioned, some of those larger vegetables like um, pumpkins or summer squash, watermelons, you're probably better off planting those outside of a square foot garden and using the square foot for just plants that would fit better in that space. Potentially a cost of materials, the box, the construction quality, and then the soil mix are all going to be things that you do have to think about. Of course, you can salvage a lot of that stuff, but the soil mix would probably be one of the main initial expenses. There could be some diseases from poor air circulation, so that's one thing to think about as well. Um, that weed barrier and the potting soil you're using doesn't allow the plants to tap into the nutrients in the soil if you do have good soil. So you do need to constantly add fertility. And also just making sure that you continue to do that with the compost, just so that you have good fertility in your soil. And so that's actually all I've got to talk about with square foot gardening. You can ask a couple questions here in a minute. I just have a couple slides with different upcoming events. The first one is the Garden Discovery Festival that's going to be happening at McCrory Gardens here on May 19th from 1:30 to 4:30. There'll be a Master Gardener plant sale, a Native Plant Initiative plant sale, and lots of different educational booths. So that's going to be a really fun event. Then another webinar series that we have upcoming is our Backyard Natural Resources webinar series coming up in these next couple weeks. We're going to be talking about soil health in the garden, water conservation strategies, grasslands and how those relate to our home gardens, and biodiversity. And then here's a list of the Native Plant Initiative plant sales for 2024. That first one in Brookings is at the Garden Discovery Festival. There's a couple at West River and Spearfish in Rapid City the first weekend in June. And then we have a couple more back East River and Huron, Sioux Falls, and back to Brookings on August 3rd for the McCrory Gardens Garden Party. So we're also going to be doing some research upcoming with the SDSU Extension Horticulture on specialty crop and gardening research needs. So if you are one that likes to take surveys and you have a smartphone and want to scan this QR code, this is just asking about what types of things that gardeners around our area and specialty crop producers are concerned about in their gardens and production. And that's it. So with that, I'll leave this up for a couple minutes and then turn it back over to you, Amanda.
All right. I am never that organized when planning a garden. I should really measure things more, is what I took away from that.
Yeah, I know. I think it's going to be kind of fun to try, but I'm usually more haphazard too. I'm just like, oh, I'll have a plan, but then I actually, in the moment, I'm like, oh, never mind. I think I want to do this instead. So we'll see if I can confine myself into a more organized method this year.
I can't wait to see progress pictures as we continue the Garden Hour series. I know last year, Dr. Lang would give us updates on some of her patio plants that she was, trying out. So
I will
it's
definitely do that.
another reason to tune back into Garden Hour as we continue the season.
Yep.
We had one question come in about rhubarb. How do you feel about rhubarb questions?
I guess it depends on what it is.
All right, I'll
Rhubarb in
give
a
it to
square
you.
foot or just rhubarb in general?
Just rhubarb in general.
Okay.
I'll give it to you, and if we don't have a good answer, we'll talk about the garden hotline and how we can get this question submitted for them. But they have 3 rhubarb plants, and they've been there for many years. All 3 of the plants are bolting. Is there anything they can or should do? They haven't experienced this before.
Well, I've actually heard from a number of people this spring that said that their rhubarb was bolting really quickly. And I'm just wondering if it isn't because of the warm winter that we had. It wasn't as
Yeah.
cold. And so that might be one of the issues. I can't, guarantee that. Um, I would say I know you can cut those seed heads off. A lot of times it'll just kind of spur them on to producing more, but that might be a way to kind of slow it down a little bit. Um, but yeah, I have heard of other people say that their rhubarb is already going to seed, and it's just the beginning of May. So I think it
Yeah.
could just be due to the exceptionally warm winter that we had.
Yeah, and so I guess whoever asked that, depending on where you are in the state, that might help us too. But yeah, the question did sound a little bit familiar. I'm like, I feel like I've seen this one come across the Ask Extension widget or something. But yeah, we've if the folks we have in Garden Hour, if it's not our area of expertise, we do have other ways to get your question answered. We have the Ask Extension widget on our problems and solutions page, and then our garden hotlines are live throughout the state. We have Aberdeen, Sioux Falls, Pierre, and Rapid City. And so those are each staffed by a garden hotline employee with varying schedules, but they all have emails and phone numbers. So you're welcome to submit questions through those venues. And Robin and I, we all talk to the garden hotline folks, and so we can get a sense of what's coming in there, and you might see your question on a future episode of Garden Hour.
Yep.
And I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, but I'll switch over to my slides and we'll talk about some bugs.
All right, that sounds great.
All right. I'm starting off with the periodical cicadas because I've had a couple questions about these already, and I did put an article out, but if you're a cicada fan, the bad news is that they're not in South Dakota. If you're not a cicada fan, the good news is that they're not in South Dakota. I'm a cicada fan, so I'm planning my trip to go see these fantastic insects. But they've been making the national news because there are broods emerging in two different broods that are emerging, a 13-year brood and a 17-year brood. And the math lines up and they're coming out in the same year. And if you do want to go see them, you're going to want to head to Southeast Iowa, Missouri, Illinois. Those are kind of the closest areas to see them. And they're starting to really take off in Missouri right now. I'm actually headed on an adventure this weekend to go to St. Louis and see some cicadas. So next week I should have some on the ground footage from the cicada apocalypse. But these are different than our annual cicadas because they're emerging en masse and it only happens, once every 13 or once every 17 years. You can see the picture here is of a periodical cicada. I got to go see brood 10 in 2021 in Pennsylvania. And you can see these guys are a little bit different than our cicadas. They have a dark black or brown body with bright red eyes. Our annual cicada species are sort of green and brownish, pretty chill looking, and they come out later in the year in July or August, depending on where you are. So if you want to do some insect tourism, check out iNaturalist or the Cicada Safari app. You can see the latest sort of postings of people who have been observing them. And so I've been anxiously refreshing the Cicada Safari app to see where the hotspots are going to be in Missouri for my visit. And touching on some insects that are actually here in South Dakota, usually when the weather starts warming up, I get more questions about some insects indoors that maybe shouldn't be inside. I haven't gotten quite as many this year, and I wonder if, much like with the rhubarb bolting, if it's because we've had a more mild winter across a lot of South Dakota. So some of these insects were making their way outdoors maybe a little bit sooner than they should have, and then dying when we got a couple cold snaps. But you may have noticed some insects that overwinter as adults being active, pretty early. You may have some wasps flying around already. Now is a great time to be seeing what those wasps are doing. And if you notice that they're building a nest in a place that you don't want a wasp nest, now is the time to take care of that. Scrape it off now, hit them with the wasp spray now before the nest gets to be massive by the time we get to like September, and then folks are wondering what to do. And then my advice is to wait until it freezes. Lady beetles also overwinter as adults, especially the multicolored Asian lady beetle. So you might be seeing a lot of those moving around already. And then you might have some incursions of ants. Maybe some ants have found their way into your house. Sometimes they're scouting for food and they find their way inside, especially when sort of it's, a little bit moister around structure. Maybe there's a hole in a screen or some weather stripping that's not so great. I used to have, ants that would go for the cat food every spring like clockwork, and a couple of the little ant bait stations would take care of them pretty quickly. But if you're noticing insect activity indoors, now is a great time to take those pictures, shoot me an email, drop me a question in the chat, and we can see sort of what it is, because identifying the insect is the first step to making sure that you are, going to be going after some sort of, successful or plausibly successful management strategy. So you'll always want to identify before you engage in any sort of treatment plan. It's also time to think about ticks. With the mild winter and the early warm up this spring, ticks got active. I was getting reports from friends with dogs in March that were, they were coming inside with, little tiny ticks on them. And in our part of the country, the American dog tick is one of our major tick species. It's one of the most prevalent. It at least has the decency of being fairly large as an adult, so it's easy to spot on your body or on your pet's body, but the nymphs are obviously smaller and a little bit trickier to find. I highly recommend checking out the Tick Encounter website that the University of Rhode Island hosts. It's got a ton of great pictures of ticks in all different life stages, and then also whether they're fed or unfed. It can really help if you're somebody who spends a lot of time outdoors or your pets are spending a lot of time outdoors. You want to make sure that you are stocked up on repellent for ticks. Make sure you're using something with an EPA approved active ingredient and that you're reading and following those label directions so that you know how frequently to reapply, and then also what to do with your clothing or your body after you're done being in tick country. If you have animals like dogs, now's a great time to talk to your vet and make sure that you have a product that is going to be either a tick repellent or a tick killer that kills them once they bite the animal. So better to be prepared at the start of the season than end up with something like Rocky Mountain spotted fever or tularemia later in the year. And just some tick ranges, you can see the whole state is in American dog tick country. Again, our most sort of prevalent tick. Black-legged tick, you can see that the range map includes the eastern third of the state. The black-legged tick used to be called the deer tick. This is the one that vectors Lyme disease. If you are spending time in Minnesota, make sure that you're protecting yourself against ticks because they do have black-legged ticks, quite a few of them. Usually it's more wooded areas where these ticks are an issue, but they can be in they can be in suburban areas too. But we're in the range, but we don't have a ton of black-legged ticks in South Dakota. And then the Lone Star tick, you can see, is getting closer to the state, but the Lone Star tick is the one that vectors the alpha-gal protein that makes you allergic to red meat. So there's a couple different reasons why you want to protect yourself from tick bites. So now is truly the time of year to make sure that you've got those repellents, you're protecting your pets, and that you're, doing tick checks when you get in from areas of tall grass where you might have picked some up. Ticks will spend a little bit of time before they settle down to feed. So when you come inside, if you change your clothes, take a shower, do a tick check, you can, hopefully find them before they actually bite you. So don't sleep on tick safety. And then as a palate cleanser from the ticks, when will the monarch butterflies show up? And I think they're going to be getting here pretty soon. I just pulled this map today from Journey North. Journey North, another great sort of community science website where you can report observations of monarch sightings and a whole bunch of other critters. This is the map of the first monarch sighting. So the people who submitted this data, it was the first monarch that they saw. And you can see the sort of darker green color. Those are observations from this past week. The lighter green colors are from earlier in the spring. And I crossed out the one up there in Minnesota because I clicked on it and it had a picture associated with it and it was a red admiral butterfly. So that was not a correct observation up there in Minnesota, but you can see that they're already around the Lincoln area in Nebraska. So I think we'll be seeing monarch butterflies here in not too long. And then this time of year, the NOMO May articles make the rounds pretty heavily. If you have a turf lawn and you want to keep your turf happy, you really want to be mowing high. With the amount of rain we had here in Pierre, I would have needed some sort of like hay mower if I just let my grass keep going for this whole month. So I've been setting my mower to its highest setting, and then I mow the grass and it's taking off the top third of the grass, but it's not low enough that it's hitting the dandelions or even the cute little violets that are hanging out in my lawn. So don't feel bad about turning on the lawnmower in May. Just set your mower deck high, and you're going to be, leaving some of those floral resources that are in your lawn. And if the only floral resources in your lawn are dandelions, now's a great time of year to, think about adding some more of those early blooming perennials. And I was so glad that Robin highlighted the Native Plant Initiative plant sales, because those are great places to find some of those native perennials with material that was sourced in South Dakota and grown in South Dakota by grad students at SDSU. And yeah, upcoming events, Robin and I are going to be doing a lot of the same things. So it's going to be great to be able to, see her in person, but we'll be on the Backyard Natural Resources webinar series, hosting that together over the next 2 weeks. And then, yeah, Garden Discovery Festival is going to be at McCrory Gardens on May 19th, and I'll be bringing my pinned insect collection. I have one of our regular cicadas in there. Possibly by May 19th, I'll have an annual cicada, I'll have a periodical cicada in there as well. So you'll be able to see the two of them right next to each other. So I will go ahead and stop sharing. And let's see if we have anything in the Q&A. Doesn't look like we have any outstanding questions. But yeah, Robin, what plant are you most excited about in your garden this year?
All right. Well, I want to plant a few more native plants as well. So that's really exciting. I just bought a house, not this last October, but the one before, and last summer, because I was in grad school, I really didn't have time to do very much planting. So I've got big aspirations for this summer. For vegetables, I always like to grow colorful varieties, and I love purple. So I actually bought a lot of different purple colored vegetables. So we'll see how those do. Purple radishes, purple peas, kohlrabi, all kinds of things like that. So
Oh, that's awesome. I don't think I've ever seen the purple peas before.
yeah, they're a tendril pea. A sugar magnolia is the variety, and the pods are purple. So the
Oh,
peas
that's
inside are
awesome.
green, and then if you do cook them, they'll
Hmm.
turn green again. But
Yeah, that's the I remember I grew purple potatoes once in grad school, and that was the thing, is they look super cool when you slice them, but when you cook them, they turn like a weird gray color, and you're like,
yes.
these taste fine. They're just potatoes, but they look like you.
I know. Yeah, my kids have mentioned that before too, because I always grow purple potatoes because, like I said, I love purple and some regular varieties too. But yeah, mashed potatoes with purple potatoes, not exactly the most appealing thing. I usually
It's
just
very
try to
much,
focus on roasting them.
yep. Yeah, it's very much like Beauty and the Beast, like try the gray stuff, it's delicious. Like that's
Yep.
absolutely what those turn into.
Yep.
But
How about
yeah,
you?
and oh man, I bought a bunch of tomatoes recently. Well, I tried to have a responsible number of tomato plants because I always end up planting too
That's
many.
difficult to do.
Yeah, but our local garden center here in Pierre did this great thing where they put together a mixed like 6-pack of tomatoes and then one of peppers. So I was able to grab a mixed like pack and get like, Juliets and sun sugars and Cherokee purple and like a couple other things that I maybe wouldn't have tried otherwise, but it's like I don't need 4 Juliet tomato plants. Having one of them in this like assortment is perfect.
Yeah,
So
that's a
I'm
great
I'm
idea.
excited about those. And I got
Yep.
a pineapple tomato. I haven't grown that one before, but
Hmm.
it sounds cool.
Yeah. I think my
So,
one of my favorite tomatoes is atomic grape, and that's kind of like smaller than a Roma, bigger than a pear, and it's kind of
mhm.
stripy, and it's just got a really interesting flavor. So
Yeah,
I
the
always,
atomics, the
mm,
bumblebees are really like stripy and cool. And green
yep.
zebra is one of my favorites, and I
Ooh,
snagged a plant of that one too.
oh,
I
nice.
love tomatoes. I have truly, except for like the bland off-season grocery store tomatoes, have never met a
Yeah.
tomato I didn't like. So
Yep.
those are my like when you talk about square foot gardening, it's like my square foot garden would just be all tomatoes.
Yeah.
Let's see. We got a question in the chat on grasshoppers. Yeah, grasshoppers are going to be going gangbusters, unfortunately. One of my colleagues out in Rapid City, he found an adult already, like so an adult that survived the winter and didn't die. So you're going to want to be scouting early for grasshoppers. Right now, everything is very lush and green in central South Dakota, at least. So they will be, hanging out in the grass and hopefully not bothering crops that we care about. But the problem is when those road ditches and, those things start to dry down, that's when we see grasshoppers moving into our gardens and our crops. But I believe Pest and Crop Newsletter, I think there was a grasshopper article just within the last week or two on kind of an update on the season. Let's see. I'll give this one to you, Robin. Do you have a recommended soil mix for raised beds? What about the moisture retaining type of fertilizer already in the mix?
Yeah, well, I know in the presentation, it recommended having an equal amount of those three different components, whether it's like some sort of fiber, like the coconut coir. That's really good at retaining moisture. And then the vermiculite also helps with moisture. So I think just making sure that you don't have a raised bed that's either, you don't want to use like seed starting mix where there's really no nutrients or anything, and it's just the water just kind of goes right through it. And you also don't want it to be too heavy on like compost or garden soil, because that is actually probably too dense for a lot of what you want to achieve in a square foot garden. So it's really just kind of having that good mix of the nutrients and the fibers, like the peat moss or the coconut coir. I've even on a bag of potting mix that I bought, they had yucca fibers in it too. So
Hmm.
that's an interesting thing that I hadn't heard of, but maybe another good sustainable alternative. I'm not sure. But yeah, just having it be the right kind of fluffy consistency, but also retaining water. And it really, I've seen different ratios where it's just, 75% uh, potting mix and a quarter or like 25% compost. It really kind of depends on what your sources are for your materials and what kind of compost that you have. But you might want to play around with it and see what
Yeah.
works best.
Yeah, I should maybe next week I'll have to throw in the pictures from I got to tour a greenhouse like research facility at Ohio State a couple weeks
Okay.
ago, and they were doing the vertical like growing of the most like sweet, delicious tomatoes. And they just had a whole bunch and they're like, here, take as many as you want. And I'm just like eating so many tomatoes.
Yeah.
But those, it was all hydroponic, so no
Okay.
soil, obviously
All right.
indoor controlled environment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but rock wool is what those plants were being grown in because all the nutrition is coming through as a liquid.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
that was super interesting.
Yeah, that
Obviously,
is
you
really
wouldn't do that
interesting.
outside.
Yep. Well, and I know with tomatoes, those indeterminate varieties, you can trellis them really well. So a lot of times you'll think tomatoes just take up a huge amount of
Hmm.
space, but with those ones, if you have those kind of like a frame with string or the trellis on the back of the square foot garden, you can actually train those up so they
Hmm.
don't take quite as much space in the garden.
Yeah,
So,
and you can do that with some of the smaller varieties of squashes as well, like some of the
mhm.
cucumbers or the little like cucamelons, like some of the cuter, more
Yeah.
well-behaved cucurbits you can
Yeah.
trellis. But I do agree with your assessment that like pumpkins, not a good choice for a square foot garden.
Yeah.
Those will absolutely take over.
hmm
Um, but yeah, if there's any last minute questions from the audience, feel free to get those in now. Otherwise, we will wrap up this first edition of the 2024 Garden Hour series. I will be back with you all next week hosting. And Robin, I'm not sure when we see you again on Garden Hour, but I know we're going to see you on the Backyard Natural Resources webinar, which is going to be super exciting. I'm looking forward to learning. We're talking about soil
hmm
health,
Yep.
water, grasslands. The grasslands one I think is going to be really interesting, and I hope a lot of people sign up for it. And then we'll be talking about biodiversity.
Yep. Yeah, the grasslands one is kind of interesting. I saw Laura Kaler, who's going to be our presenter for that one, speak at the Grasslands Initiative conference in March, I think it was. And it was just fascinating to hear. And it was very encouraging, actually, to hear about how grasslands are really being celebrated, and a lot of livestock producers, beef producers are really trying to restore a lot of the native grasslands just because there's so many benefits, and how those grasslands really affect our communities and how our communities can kind of affect grasslands as well. So I think it'll really be a great presentation to tie those two things together, the grasslands that we think about out on the range, West River maybe, and then what we do even in our backyards, and how those things can be related.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really, really interesting. And hopefully, as after people watch that when they're driving around, they'll have some more appreciation for some of the big wide open spaces that they're driving by.
Yep.
And much like Garden Hour, the Backyard Natural Resources webinar will also be recorded and posted on YouTube. So register. Even if you can't join us live, you'll get links to the recordings as well. You can kind of then, turn off the visual and just listen to us like a podcast if you want.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's all we have for this week of Garden Hour. Robin, thank you so much for hopping on with me for the first one.
Yes,
Thank you
thank you.
also to Matt Knipling in the background running the technology for us. And thank you to our attendees for joining us live and asking us great questions. And hopefully we'll see you either next week or at some other point in the season. And until then, happy gardening.
Yeah.